Rain hammered the tall windows of the pack house when Kalen Voss pushed through the back door, his boots heavy with mud, and his shoulder aching from a fight at the northern border. He wanted nothing more than silence and a hot meal, but the kitchen light was already on, spilling a thin gold line across the hallway floor. He paused. At this hour, past midnight, the kitchen should have been empty. He stepped closer, careful not to let his boots scrape the tile, and looked through the gap in the door. A young woman sat alone at the long wooden table, her shoulders curled inward, a bowl of soup cooling untouched in front of her. Her hair fell over her face like a curtain, but it could not hide the way her body shook with quiet, controlled sobs. She was trying so hard not to make a sound that the effort itself looked painful. Kalen recognized her at once. Elira, the only daughter of Callum, his beta, and closest friend for over a decade. He had watched her grow from a small girl who used to hide behind her father's legs into a composed, capable young woman who helped run half the pack's daily errands without ever being asked twice. She was the one who remembered everyone's birthday, who brought blankets to the pups during storms, who smiled first thing in the morning, even when the weather was as miserable as it was tonight. He had never once seen her cry. For a moment, he considered stepping back and pretending he had seen nothing. It was late, and this looked like the kind of moment a person needed alone, but something about the way her hands trembled around the spoon, gripping it so tightly her knuckles had gone pale, made him stay rooted where he was. He knocked softly on the doorframe instead of walking straight in, giving her a second's warning. Elira jerked upright immediately, swiping both hands across her face in one fast motion. By the time she turned to him, her eyes were dry, or seemed to be, and her mouth had already curved into the easy, familiar smile the whole pack knew her for. "Alpha," she said, her voice light and steady, as if nothing at all had happened. "You're back late. Should I heat that soup up for you? There's plenty left." Kalen studied her for a long moment before answering. Her eyes were red-rimmed, despite her best effort, and there was a faint puffiness beneath them that no amount of blinking could erase. Yet she held herself with the same calm posture she always did, spine straight, hands folded, as though crying alone in an empty kitchen at midnight was something perfectly ordinary. "I'm fine," he said, setting his damp jacket over the back of a chair. "Long night at the border, nothing serious," he nodded toward her bowl. "You're up late yourself." "Couldn't sleep," she said simply, standing to fetch him a plate before he could ask for one. "I thought I'd get a snack instead of staring at the ceiling." It was a reasonable explanation. Plenty of people struggled to sleep, but Kalen had led this pack long enough to know the difference between someone who simply couldn't sleep and someone who had been sitting alone with a private weight crushing down on her chest. He said nothing further, though, because pressing her now, when she'd clearly worked so hard to compose herself, felt like the wrong kind of kindness. Instead, he took the plate she offered and sat across from her, letting the quiet stretch between them, while the storm outside rattled gently against the windows. Elira busied herself wiping down a counter that was already clean, her movements quick and practiced, the movements of someone who needed her hands occupied so her mind wouldn't wander somewhere darker. "How's your father?" Kalen asked eventually, keeping his tone light. "Haven't seen much of him since the supply meeting." "Busy," Elira said, a small, genuine smile finally breaking through. "He's been helping settle the new families near the Eastern Ridge. He barely sits still long enough to eat these days." "Sounds like him." Kalen took a bite of the soup, which was, admittedly, very good. "You've always been good at taking care of people, your father included, from what I hear." Something flickered across her face at that, gone so fast he almost missed it, a tightening around her eyes. A flash of something that looked, for half a second, like exhaustion so deep it bordered on despair. Then it vanished, replaced by her usual easy warmth. "Someone has to," she said lightly, and turned back to the sink. Kalen finished his meal in silence, watching her from the corner of his eye. She moved efficiently around the kitchen, refilling the kettle, straightening chairs that didn't need straightening, humming under her breath in a way that felt less like contentment and more like a shield. Every gesture was polished, every word chosen carefully. It struck him, not for the first time but more sharply than before, that Elira seemed to spend enormous energy making sure everyone around her believed she was completely fine. He thanked her for the meal and rose to leave, but paused at the doorway, glancing back. She had already returned to the table, staring down at her own hands resting on the wood. For just a moment, before she noticed him watching, Her expression collapsed into something raw and tired, something far older than her years should have allowed. Then she caught his gaze, and the mask slid back into place instantly. So smoothly, it was almost frightening how practiced the motion had become. "Good night, Alpha," she said warmly. "Good night, Alira," he replied, and forced himself to walk away, even though every instinct told him something in that kitchen had been far from fine. He did not sleep well that night. Long after he'd changed out of his wet clothes and lain down, his thoughts kept circling back to her face in that unguarded second, to the sound of her trying so hard not to be heard crying, to the strange, hollow brightness of her smile. He told himself it was probably nothing. Young people had rough nights sometimes. Stress from pack duties, maybe a disagreement with a friend, the ordinary weight of being 20-something and trying to hold your life together. It happened. It didn't need to mean anything more than that. But as an alpha, Kaylin had spent years learning to read the difference between a person who was tired and a person who was drowning quietly beneath a surface no one else could see. And something about the practiced way Alira had wiped her tears, the speed with which she'd rearranged her face into cheerfulness, the sheer skill of it, told him this wasn't the first time she'd cried alone in that kitchen. It was simply the first time he happened to walk in on it. The following morning, he found himself watching her more closely than he ever had before. She was at the training yard by sunrise, helping the younger pack members stretch before their drills, laughing at something one of the boys said, correcting a girl's footwork with patient encouragement. Later, she helped carry supplies to the new families settling near the eastern ridge, her arms full of blankets, her smile unwavering the entire time. At midday, she sat with the elders, listening to their stories with genuine interest, refilling their tea without being asked. Everywhere Kaylin looked, Alira was helping someone, comforting someone, making someone else's day a little easier. And in every single interaction, she was warm, present, generous with her attention. It was the kind of behavior that made a pack love someone. It was also, he began to realize with a slow, uneasy feeling settling into his chest, the kind of behavior a person adopted when they had learned, somewhere along the way, that their own needs mattered less than everyone else's. He caught Callum near the training grounds in the early afternoon. The beta's arms crossed as he watched his daughter demonstrate a defensive stance to a cluster of eager pups. "She's good with them," Kaylin said, coming to stand beside him. Callum smiled, pride evident in every line of his weathered face. "She's always been that way, since she was small. Whenever someone was upset, she'd be the first one there trying to fix it." He chuckled. "I used to joke that she'd make a better beta than me one day." Kaylin said nothing, but the words settled uncomfortably in his mind. Always the first one there trying to fix it, always taking care of everyone else. He wondered, not for the first time that day, who took care of Alira when something was wrong, who was there for her in the quiet hours when the house had gone dark and the mask could finally slip. He watched her laugh at something one of the pups said, watched the easy affection in the way she ruffled the child's hair, and thought again of the sound of her crying, alone at that table. So careful, so quiet, so practiced at not being heard. Something was wrong beneath that smile. He didn't yet know what, or how deep it ran, but he knew, with the certainty of a man who had led this pack through storms far worse than the one from the night before, that he was not going to simply look away and pretend he hadn't seen it. Whatever weight Alira was carrying alone, he decided as the afternoon sun sank lower over the training yard, he intended to find out exactly how heavy it truly was. 3 days passed before Kaylin found a natural reason to be near Alira again, without making his interest obvious. He told himself he was simply doing what any responsible alpha would do, keeping an eye on a member of his pack who might be struggling. But if he was honest with himself, the reason ran deeper than duty. He had not stopped thinking about that unguarded second in the kitchen, the way her face had fallen apart before she caught him watching. He began noticing patterns he had somehow missed before, patterns that had probably been there for years, hidden in plain sight because Alira was so skilled at hiding them. She was always the last to eat at pack gatherings, insisting everyone else be served first, and more often than not she barely touched her own plate before finding some task that needed her attention elsewhere. She was always the one to offer to take the hardest shifts, the coldest patrols, the longest hours, waving off anyone who tried to relieve her with a cheerful comment about not minding the extra work. When someone paid her a compliment, she deflected it instantly, turning the conversation back to the other person with practiced ease. When someone offered her help, she found a polite way to decline it within seconds, usually followed by an offer to help them instead. It was as though she had built an entire identity around being useful, around being fine, around never once needing anything from anyone. And the more Kalen watched, the more it looked less like a personality and more like a wall. He found her on the fourth day near the training grounds, sitting on the low fence with the younger pack members, teaching them a simple hand-to-hand technique. Her laughter rang out easily as one of the boys stumbled and landed on his back in the dirt, and she reached down to pull him up with an encouraging word. She was good with them, genuinely good, patient, in a way that came from real affection rather than obligation. When the lesson ended and the children scattered toward the dining hall, Kalen approached, keeping his tone casual. "You've got a gift with them," he said, nodding toward the retreating group of pups. Elira brushed dust from her sleeves, smiling up at him. "They're good kids, easy to teach when they actually want to learn. Your father tells me you've been handling most of the coordination for the Eastern Ridge settlement too. Supplies, housing assignments, all of it. Someone needed to organize it," she said with a small shrug. It wasn't a big deal. Kalen watched her carefully. "That's a lot on top of the training sessions. And the border patrol rotations you volunteered for last week. And the harvest count you offered to redo when the numbers didn't match up." Her smile faltered, just slightly, the way a plank might creak under weight it wasn't quite built to hold. "I like staying busy," she said. "Idle hands and all that. Elira." He said her name gently, without any edge to it, and watched her shoulders tense anyway, as though she already sensed where the conversation might be heading. "You don't have to prove anything to this pack. You know that, right? Nobody here is keeping score of how much you do." For a moment, something flickered across her face, too fast to fully read, but Kalen caught the shape of it anyway. Surprise, maybe, or something closer to fear, the fear of being seen too clearly. Then it smoothed over, and she laughed lightly, waving a hand as though brushing the comment aside like a stray leaf. "I know that," she said. "I just like helping. It makes me happy." He let it go for the moment, though every instinct told him the answer had been rehearsed long before this conversation, polished from years of repetition, until it came out smooth and convincing. He walked with her back toward the main house, talking about ordinary pack matters, the upcoming harvest festival, a dispute between two neighboring families that needed mediating, and she engaged easily, offering thoughtful suggestions, her mind clearly sharp and capable. It was later that same evening, during a training session gone slightly wrong, that Kalen finally saw something he could not simply explain away. The younger warriors had been practicing defensive holds, and Elira had stepped in to demonstrate a technique for a girl struggling with the movement. In the middle of the demonstration, her partner's grip slipped, catching the edge of her sleeve and tearing the fabric clean along the seam near her forearm. Elira froze instantly, her free hand shooting to cover the exposed skin before anyone else could get a clear look. But Kalen was standing close enough, and his eyes were sharp enough, that in the single second before she managed to hide it, he saw them clearly, thin lines, pale and old, crossing the inside of her forearm, in a pattern too deliberate, too orderly, to be accidental. Scars that had healed long ago, but had clearly been made on purpose, years of careful concealment, beneath long sleeves, and quick excuses about training bruises. His stomach dropped. Elira's face had gone white. She mumbled something about needing to change, and hurried off the training field so fast that the girl she'd been training with blinked in confusion, unsure what had just happened. Kalen stood rooted to the spot, his mind racing back through every interaction of the past several days, every piece suddenly slotting into a picture far darker than he had let himself imagine. The exhaustion behind her smile, the desperate need to stay busy, to be useful, to never sit still long enough for her own thoughts to catch up with her, the way she deflected every kindness, as though she didn't believe she deserved it. The tears in the kitchen, so careful and quiet, the tears of someone who had learned long ago that crying loudly meant someone might actually ask what was wrong, and that was a question she clearly didn't know how to answer. He did not chase after her. Some instinct told him that cornering her now, in the wake of such raw exposure, would only push her further behind whatever walls she had spent years building. Instead, he returned to his study that night and sat with the weight of what he'd seen, turning it over slowly, trying to understand how someone so beloved, so central to the daily life of this pack, could be carrying something so heavy without a single person noticing. He thought about Callum, working tirelessly to help the pack expand and thrive, always occupied, always trusted completely, with responsibilities that kept him away from home for long stretches. He thought about how easy it must have been for Elira to learn, somewhere in her childhood, that everyone around her was too busy fixing bigger problems to notice the quiet ache in their own house. And he thought about how skilled she had become at making sure no one ever had a reason to look closer. Somewhere out there, past the dark windows of his study, Elira was likely lying awake in her own room, replaying the moment her sleeve had torn, wondering how much he had seen, and whether her carefully built world was about to come apart. Kalen made a decision that night, sitting alone with the fire burning low in the hearth. He would not treat what he'd seen as gossip to whisper about, nor would he ignore it and pretend the image hadn't burned itself into his memory. He would find a way to reach her, carefully, patiently, without frightening her into retreating further behind her practiced smile. But before he did anything else, he knew there was one conversation he needed to have first, one that would be difficult in an entirely different way. He needed to speak with Callum, and he needed to find the right words to tell his oldest friend that his daughter had been suffering in silence for longer than either of them could guess, right beneath his own roof, without him ever noticing at all. Callum was checking a stack of ledgers in his small office off the main hall when Kalen knocked and let himself in, without waiting for an answer, a habit the two men had shared since they were young warriors training side by side. Callum looked up, immediately reading something serious in his alpha's expression. "You look like a man carrying bad news," Callum said, setting his pen down. "Not bad news exactly," Kalen said, pulling a chair closer and sitting across from him. "But something you need to know, about Elira." Callum's easy expression shifted instantly into concern. "Is she hurt? Did something happen on patrol?" "Nothing happened today, not in the way you mean." Kalen chose his next words carefully, aware that whatever he said next would land like a blow his old friend never saw coming. "I saw something during training this afternoon. Her sleeve tore. I saw marks on her arm, Callum. Old ones, the kind that don't come from training or from any accident." For a long moment, Callum simply stared at him, his face slowly draining of color as understanding settled in. "What kind of marks?" Kalen held his gaze steadily. "The kind a person makes on purpose when they're hurting in a way they don't know how to say out loud." The silence that followed stretched long enough that the only sound in the room was the faint crackle of the fire in the small hearth. Callum's hands, usually steady and sure, trembled slightly as he pressed them flat against the desk. "That's not possible," he said finally, though his voice lacked conviction. "She's happy. She's always laughing, always helping everyone. She would have told me if something was wrong. She tells me everything." "Does she?" Kalen asked gently. "When was the last time she told you something was actually difficult for her? Not pack business, not someone else's problem she was solving. Something about herself." Callum opened his mouth to answer, then closed it again, his brow furrowed as he clearly searched his memory and came up empty. The realization seemed to hit him slowly, like cold water rising past his ankles, before he understood he was standing in a flood. "I've been so consumed with the Eastern settlement," he said quietly, more to himself than to Kalen. "The border disputes. The supply routes. I thought she was fine because she never gave me a reason to think otherwise. She was always the strong one. Even as a child, when her mother passed, she was the one comforting me, instead of the other way around." He pressed a hand over his eyes. "I let a child comfort me through grief, instead of asking whether she needed comforting herself. And I never stopped to wonder if that pattern just kept going." Kalen let him sit with that for a moment before speaking again. "You're not the villain here, Callum. You didn't do this to her. But she's been carrying something alone for a long time, maybe years, and she's gotten very good at making sure no one notices. That's not a failure on your part alone. It's something the whole pack missed, myself included, until 3 nights ago." "What happened 3 nights ago?" Kalen told him about the kitchen, about the soup gone cold, about the quiet, careful way she'd cried without making a sound, and the speed with which she'd erased every trace of it the moment she realized she wasn't alone. Callum listened with his jaw tight, his eyes glistening in the firelight, absorbing every detail, like a man forcing himself to look directly at something he desperately wished he could look away from. "What do we do?" he asked finally, his voice rough. "I can't just walk up to her and demand she explain herself. She'll shut down completely. She spent her whole life learning how to seem fine. If we push too hard, she might just get better at hiding it instead of actually opening up." "I know," Kalen said. That's why I came to you first, before doing anything else. We need to be careful, patient. She needs to feel safe enough to let her guard down on her own, not cornered into it. Callum nodded slowly, though the guilt in his expression hadn't lessened. I should talk to her. You should, Kaelin agreed. But not tonight, and not as an interrogation. Let her feel that things are simply normal between you for now. Spend time with her the way you used to, before all the settlement work pulled you away. Let her remember that you're present, not just busy. And you? Callum asked. What's your part in this? Kaelin considered the question longer than perhaps he should have. I saw her at her most exposed moment, he said finally. I think, whether either of us likes it or not, she's going to be watching to see what I do with that. Whether I treat her differently. Whether I say anything to anyone, I want her to learn that I'm not someone she needs to fear or perform for. That might take time to build. Callum studied his old friend for a long moment, something unreadable passing behind his eyes. You care about her, he said. It wasn't quite a question. I care about every member of this pack, Kaelin replied evenly, though something in his own chest tightened at the observation, a feeling he wasn't ready to examine too closely. That's not quite what I meant, Callum said, but he let the matter drop, turning instead back to the immediate concern in front of them. What if she won't open up to either of us? What if she keeps pretending nothing happened? Then we keep showing up anyway, Kaelin said, quietly, consistently, until she starts to believe that no one is going anywhere, no matter what she's hiding. They talked long into the night, mapping out small, careful ways to be present in Alira's life without overwhelming her, without turning their concern into pressure she would feel obligated to manage on top of everything else she already carried. Callum agreed to invite her to breakfast the following morning, something he hadn't done regularly in months, and to simply ask about her day the way a father should, without any hidden agenda beneath the words. When Kaelin finally left the small office, the fire had burned down to embers, and Callum sat alone for a long while afterward, staring at nothing in particular, replaying years of moments in his mind, searching for all the times his daughter must have needed him, and hadn't asked, because she'd never learned that it was safe to ask at all. Outside, the storm from days earlier had finally cleared, leaving the sky scattered with stars above the quiet pack house. Somewhere within those walls, Alira slept, or tried to, unaware that the two men who cared for her most had just begun quietly rearranging their lives around the discovery of exactly how much she'd been hiding, and exactly how determined they both were to help her stop. Breakfast the next morning felt strange to Alira from the very first moment she walked into the dining room and found her father already seated at the small table by the window, 2 plates set out instead of the usual single bowl he grabbed on his way out the door. He looked up when she entered, and for a heartbeat, she saw something searching in his expression before it softened into a warm, easy smile. Thought we could eat together for once, Callum said, gesturing to the empty chair. Feels like it's been ages. Alira sat slowly, an odd unease settling in her stomach that she couldn't quite name. Her father wasn't usually one for lingering breakfasts, not since the Eastern settlement work had picked up. She studied his face, searching for whatever had prompted this sudden change, but found nothing except genuine warmth. Everything okay? She asked carefully, reaching for the bread basket. Everything's fine, Callum said, and something in his tone made the words feel deliberately gentle, as though he were handling something fragile. I just realized I haven't asked how you've been in a long time. Not about the pack, not about the settlement, about you. The question landed harder than she expected, and Alira felt her chest tighten in a way that had nothing to do with hunger. I've been good, she said automatically, the response leaping out before she'd even considered it. Busy, but good. Busy, Callum repeated, nodding slowly. You've taken on an awful lot lately. The training sessions, the coordination work, the extra patrols. I worry you're stretching yourself too thin. I like being useful, Alira said, echoing the same line she'd given Kaelin days earlier. The line she'd used so many times it had become almost reflexive. It's not a burden. Callum reached across the table, not touching her hand, but close enough that the gesture felt like an invitation rather than a demand. You don't have to earn your place here, sweetheart. You never have. You're not just useful to this pack. You're loved by it. By me. The words hit somewhere deep and unguarded, and for a moment, Alira's careful composure wavered visibly, her eyes glassy before she blinked hard, and forced a laugh that came out thinner than she intended. "I know that," she said. "You don't need to worry about me." "I think maybe I should have been worrying a little more," Callum said gently. "For a while now." Elira's fork paused halfway to her mouth. She set it down slowly, her mind racing through the events of the past several days, searching for what might have prompted this conversation. Her sleeve, torn during training. Kaylin's steady gaze afterward, the way he hadn't chased her, but hadn't looked away either. A cold weight settled in her stomach, as pieces clicked into place. "Did someone say something to you?" she asked quietly, her voice tight. Callum hesitated, clearly weighing honesty against the fear of frightening her away entirely. "Kaylin mentioned he was concerned about you," he said carefully. "That's all. He cares about this pack, and about you specifically. So do I." Elira's face had gone pale, her hands curling into fists in her lap beneath the table where her father couldn't see. Panic flickered behind her eyes, sharp and immediate, the panic of someone who had spent years building careful walls, only to discover a single crack had let the light through. "There's nothing to be concerned about," she said, her voice climbing slightly higher than usual, the practiced calm slipping for just a moment. "I'm fine. I'm always fine. Why does everyone suddenly think something is wrong with me?" "Nobody thinks something is wrong with you," Callum said quickly, gently. "We just want you to know that if something ever were difficult, you wouldn't have to carry it alone. That's all this is. I'm not trying to corner you." Elira stood abruptly, her chair scraping loudly against the floor. "I need to get to the training grounds," she said, her voice tight with something between hurt and fear. "The younger ones are expecting me." "Elira, I'm fine, Dad." The words came out sharper than she meant, and she saw the flash of pain cross her father's face at the edge in her tone. But she couldn't seem to stop herself, couldn't slow the momentum of retreat that had carried her through every difficult moment of her life so far. "Please, I'm fine." She left the dining room quickly, her breakfast untouched, her heart pounding, as though she'd just narrowly escaped something dangerous. In truth, she wasn't entirely certain what she'd escaped from. Concern, maybe. Kindness, offered in a form she didn't know how to accept without feeling as though the careful structure she'd built around herself might crumble the moment she let someone else see the cracks. She made her way toward the training grounds on autopilot, her thoughts a chaotic tangle of fear and old, familiar shame. Kaylin had seen the marks. Of course he had seen them, clearly enough to be concerned, clearly enough to speak with her father about it. The thought of her alpha, a man she respected deeply, looking at her, and seeing not the capable, cheerful young woman she'd worked so hard to become, but the fragile, damaged person underneath, made her stomach twist with something close to nausea. She found Kaylin already at the training grounds when she arrived, going over drill formations with a group of warriors. He glanced up when she approached, and for a moment their eyes met across the distance. She braced herself for pity, for the careful, delicate treatment people gave things they thought might break. Instead, his expression held something steadier. Not pity, something closer to quiet respect, mixed with genuine concern that didn't seem to be performing anything at all. "Elira," he said, walking over as the other warriors dispersed to their positions. "Do you have a minute?" Every instinct told her to say no, to claim urgent business elsewhere, to retreat behind the same wall that had protected her for years. But something in his steady gaze made the excuse die on her tongue. "I know you talked to my father," she said instead, her voice quieter than she intended, stripped of its usual bright composure. "About what you saw." Kaylin nodded, not flinching from the admission. "I did. I wanted him to understand, because I think he loves you enough to want to help. If he only knew there was something to help with." "There's nothing," she started, the old defense rising automatically, but he held up a hand, gentle but firm. "Please don't tell me you're fine," he said quietly. "Not because I don't want you to be, because I saw your face in that kitchen, and I saw those marks on your arm, and I think you've been telling yourself and everyone else that you're fine for a very long time, even when you weren't." Elira's eyes burned, and she looked away quickly, blinking hard against the sudden threat of tears in broad daylight, in front of the one person in this pack whose respect she valued perhaps more than anyone's. "Why does it matter to you?" she asked, the question coming out smaller than she intended, more vulnerable than she'd allowed herself to sound, in longer than she could remember. Kaylin's answer was quiet but certain. "Because you matter to this pack, Elira, and you matter to me, not because of everything you do for everyone else. Just because of who you are." The words settled somewhere deep in her chest, cracking through a wall she'd spent years reinforcing, and for the first time since that night in the kitchen, Elira found she didn't quite know how to hold herself together. They walked together away from the training grounds, past the curious glances of a few warriors who quickly returned to their drills when Kaylin's gaze passed over them. He led her toward a quiet path that wound along the edge of the forest bordering the pack house, a place where privacy came easily, and where the noise of daily pack life faded into birdsong and the soft rustle of leaves. For a long while, neither of them spoke. Elira kept her arms crossed, her sleeves pulled down carefully over her wrists, a habit so ingrained she barely noticed herself doing it anymore. Kaylin walked beside her at an unhurried pace, giving her space, rather than pressing for words she clearly wasn't ready to offer. "I don't know how to talk about it," she admitted finally, her voice barely above a whisper. "I've never actually said any of it out loud, not to anyone." "You don't have to say everything at once," Kaylin said. "Whatever you're comfortable sharing is enough." She let out a shaky breath, staring at the path ahead of them, rather than at him. "It started a long time ago. After my mother died. I was young, maybe 12. My father was drowning in his own grief, and someone had to keep things together. I thought that someone had to be me." She paused, swallowing hard. "So I learned how to be the strong one, how to smile, how to help, how to make everyone believe everything was fine, because if I fell apart too, who would be left standing?" Kaylin listened without interrupting, giving her the space to continue at her own pace. "It became a habit," she continued. "Being fine, being useful. Somewhere along the way I stopped knowing how to be anything else, and when things got hard, when the sadness got too big to carry quietly, I found a way to let it out that didn't require anyone to notice. It felt like the only thing that was mine, the only place where I didn't have to perform for anyone." Her voice cracked slightly on the last words, and she pressed her lips together, clearly fighting to hold herself steady. Kaylin resisted the urge to reach for her, sensing that what she needed most in this moment was simply to be heard without judgment, without alarm, without anyone treating her pain as something shameful or shocking. "I'm not proud of it," she added quickly, glancing at him, as though bracing for disgust or disappointment. "I know it's not healthy. I know it probably looks pathetic from the outside." "It doesn't look pathetic," Kaylin said firmly. "It looks like someone who was carrying far more than anyone her age should have had to carry, and who found a way to survive it without any support, because everyone around her assumed she was too strong to need any." Elira's eyes filled with tears at that, the first real tears she'd let anyone see since the night in the kitchen. "I didn't want anyone to worry," she said. "Everyone had their own problems. My father had the whole pack to manage. I didn't want to be one more thing on his list." "You were never supposed to be a thing on anyone's list," Kaylin said gently. "You were supposed to be a child who needed comfort after losing her mother, not a substitute caretaker for everyone else's grief." She wiped at her eyes quickly, embarrassed by the tears, despite Kaylin's steady, non-judgmental presence. "It's been years," she said. "I thought I'd gotten past all of it. Most days I really do feel fine. It's just sometimes, when everything piles up at once, the old habit comes back before I even realize what I'm doing." "Has it happened recently?" Kaylin asked carefully. "Beyond what I saw?" Elira hesitated, then nodded slowly, her gaze dropping to the ground. "The other night, before you found me in the kitchen, it had been a difficult week. The settlement work, the extra patrols, a disagreement with one of the younger warriors that I probably took too personally. It all just built up, and I didn't know what else to do with it." Kaylin felt something tighten painfully in his chest at the admission, a mixture of concern and quiet anger, not directed at her, but at every circumstance that had taught this bright, capable young woman that her own pain didn't deserve acknowledgement. "I'm glad you're telling me this," he said. "I know it isn't easy." "It's terrifying," she admitted with a small, humorless laugh. "I've spent so long making sure no one saw any of this. Now that you know, I don't know what happens next. I don't know if you'll look at me differently, if my father will." "Your father loves you," Kaylin said firmly. "That hasn't changed and never will. And as for me, I don't see you any differently than I did before, except now I understand a little more clearly just how strong you've actually had to be all these years, and how much of that strength has been spent hiding pain instead of healing it." Elira looked up at him, something uncertain but hopeful flickering behind her tear-filled eyes. "What do I do now?" she asked quietly. "I don't know how to just stop. It's been part of me for so long." "You don't have to figure it out today," Kaylin said. "But you don't have to figure it out alone either. Not anymore. Your father wants to help. I want to help. There are people in this pack, healers, who understand these kinds of struggles, who could help you find better ways to carry what's difficult without needing to hide it or hurt yourself to manage it." The suggestion clearly unsettled her, old instincts rising immediately to deflect the idea of seeking help so directly. "I don't know if I'm ready for that," she admitted. "That's all right," Kaylin said gently. "There's no deadline on being ready, but the offer will still be there whenever you are." They stood together in silence for a while longer, the forest quiet around them, the weight between them lighter somehow than it had been at the start of their walk, even though nothing had been solved, and nothing had truly changed, except the simple fact that Alira was no longer carrying her secret entirely alone. As they finally turned to head back toward the pack house, she glanced at him once more, something like gratitude softening her expression. "Thank you," she said quietly, "for not looking at me like I'm broken." "You're not broken," Kaylin said simply. "You're someone who's been strong for far too long, without anyone being strong for you in return. That's not the same thing at all." She didn't have an answer for that, but the small, genuine smile that touched her lips as they walked back together felt different from every practiced smile Kaylin had seen from her before. This one, however small, seemed real. Word of Alira's private struggle did not spread through the pack, exactly as Kaylin and Callum had agreed it should not. But something subtle shifted in the way both men moved around her in the days that followed. It wasn't obvious enough for others to notice, but Alira felt it keenly, a quiet, steady attention that neither smothered her nor disappeared the moment the conversation ended. Callum began finding small reasons to include her in his days again, asking her opinion on settlement disputes, not because he needed the help, but because he genuinely wanted her company. He started eating breakfast with her most mornings, and though neither of them brought up the difficult conversation from before, the warmth between them deepened in ways that felt like healing, even without words attached to it. Kaylin, for his part, made no dramatic gestures. He didn't treat her with the careful, breakable delicacy she had feared, nor did he pull away out of discomfort with what he now knew. Instead, he simply continued involving her in pack matters, the way he always had, consulting her opinion during meetings, walking with her occasionally along the same forest path where she'd first opened up to him, checking in with small, easy questions that never felt like interrogations. "How was your day?" became a common question from him, asked with genuine curiosity, rather than hidden concern buried beneath polite conversation. At first, Alira answered automatically, the same rehearsed responses she'd given everyone for years. But slowly, she found herself offering slightly more honest answers, admitting when a day had been difficult, admitting when she felt tired, in ways that went beyond physical exhaustion. "Rough day," she told him one afternoon, nearly a week after their conversation in the forest, as they walked back from a meeting with several visiting pack representatives. "One of the Eastern families is unhappy with their housing assignment, and I feel like I let them down somehow, even though I did everything I could." "That sounds frustrating," Kaylin said simply, without rushing to fix the problem or dismiss her feelings. "Do you want to talk it through, or would you rather just vent for a minute?" The question caught her off guard, mostly because no one had ever asked her which kind of support she wanted before. Usually people simply jumped straight to offering solutions, or worse, brushed past her frustration entirely to focus on something else. The small courtesy of being asked what she needed struck her more deeply than she expected. "Just vent, I think," she admitted, and proceeded to talk through the frustrating meeting in more detail than she usually allowed herself, while Kaylin listened without interrupting, offering the occasional understanding nod or brief comment that showed he was truly paying attention, rather than waiting for his turn to speak. It became a pattern over the following weeks, small moments accumulating steadily. Kaylin made sure she wasn't overlooked during pack gatherings, subtly steering conversations to include her, rather than letting her fade into the background the way she often preferred. He noticed when she took on too many extra duties and gently redirected some of the workload to other capable warriors, not out of doubt in her abilities, but out of genuine concern for her well-being. When she offered to give up her seat at the Harvest Festival planning table so someone else could have input, he simply pulled up another chair, instead of letting her disappear into the background as she usually would have. None of it was dramatic. None of it felt forced or performative. It was simply steady, consistent attention, the kind that slowly, patiently, began teaching Alira that she didn't have to earn her place through relentless usefulness, that she could exist among this pack simply as herself and still be valued. She noticed the change most clearly one evening during a quiet dinner with her father and several of the senior pack members, including Kaylin. The conversation had turned toward the upcoming Harvest Festival, and someone mentioned needing volunteers to help organize the event. "I can take care of it," Alira said automatically, the old reflex rising before she'd even considered whether she wanted to. "Actually," Kaylin interjected smoothly, before she could commit herself further, "I think Brielle mentioned wanting more responsibility this year. Why don't we let her take the lead, and you can advise if she needs it?" Alira blinked, caught off guard by the gentle redirection. For a moment, old anxiety flared, the fear that stepping back from a responsibility meant she was somehow failing to be useful, failing to earn her place. But she caught Kaylin's steady, encouraging gaze across the table, and something in his expression reassured her that this wasn't a rejection. It was permission. Permission to simply exist, without constantly proving her worth, through endless labor. "That sounds fair," she said finally, and felt something loosen slightly in her chest, as the conversation moved naturally onward, without her needing to fill every silence with another offer of help. Later that night, walking back toward her room after the gathering had ended, she found Kaylin waiting near the hallway, seemingly by coincidence, though she suspected it wasn't coincidence at all. "You did well tonight," he said, letting Brielle take the lead. "It felt strange," Alira admitted, "like I was doing something wrong by not volunteering for everything. That feeling will fade with time," Kaylin said. "The more you practice trusting that you don't have to earn your place, the less strange it will feel." She studied him for a moment, something warm and unfamiliar stirring in her chest, a feeling she hadn't allowed herself to examine too closely yet. "Why do you care so much about helping me with this?" she asked. "You're the Alpha King. You have an entire pack to worry about." Kaylin considered the question seriously before answering. "Because watching you struggle silently for years without anyone noticing bothers me more than I probably should admit," he said. "And because I think you deserve to feel as cared for as you've spent your whole life making everyone else feel." The sincerity in his voice left her without an easy response, and for a long moment they simply stood together in the quiet hallway, something unspoken passing between them that neither was quite ready to name. "Good night, Kaylin," she said finally, her voice softer than usual. "Good night, Alira," he replied, watching as she disappeared down the hallway toward her room, carrying with her, for the first time in longer than she could remember, the quiet, unfamiliar feeling of being genuinely seen. Weeks passed, and the change in Alira, though subtle to most of the pack, felt enormous to her. She still worked hard, still helped with training and settlement matters, but she found herself pausing now, before automatically volunteering for every task, asking herself whether she genuinely wanted to help, or whether old habits were simply pushing her forward out of fear. It wasn't always easy. Some days the pull toward relentless usefulness felt overwhelming, an old familiar comfort she instinctively reached for whenever anxiety crept in. But she had begun noticing the pattern now, catching herself in the moment, instead of only recognizing it afterward, and that awareness alone felt like progress worth acknowledging. Kaylin continued his quiet vigilance, never overbearing, never treating her differently in front of others, but always present in small, steady ways. He began inviting her to join him occasionally on border inspections, not because the task required her specifically, but because he genuinely enjoyed her company and her sharp, thoughtful observations about pack matters. She found herself looking forward to those rides more than she expected, the comfortable silences between them feeling easier than any conversation she'd had in years. During one such ride along the northern border, the peaceful rhythm of their journey was interrupted by a sudden commotion from a nearby outpost. A young warrior came sprinting toward them, panic evident in his expression. "Alpha," he gasped, nearly stumbling to a stop. "There's been an incident at the eastern ridge. A landslide, following the storms from last week. Several families are trapped, and we don't have enough hands to manage the rescue efforts." Kaylin's expression hardened instantly into focused command. "How many trapped?" "At least a dozen, maybe more. The healers are already overwhelmed, and communication with the settlement has been difficult given the damage to the roads." "Alira," Kaylin said, turning to her immediately. "You know the settlement layout better than almost anyone. I need you with me." She nodded, without hesitation. Old instincts of usefulness and new instincts of genuine capability merging together into something that finally felt balanced rather than compulsive. They rode hard toward the eastern ridge, arriving to a scene of chaos, warriors and healers moving frantically among collapsed structures and displaced families, the aftermath of the storm having weakened the hillside enough to bring several homes down entirely. For the next several hours, Illyra threw herself into the rescue efforts, alongside Kaelin and the other warriors, directing teams toward specific areas she knew from her coordination work, helping locate trapped families based on her intimate knowledge of the housing assignments she'd organized weeks earlier. Her steady presence proved invaluable, her calm, clear instructions cutting through the panic and confusion that gripped many of the frightened settlers. It was during the final hours of the rescue, as the last trapped family was finally pulled free from the wreckage of their collapsed home, that the accumulated stress of the day finally caught up with her. She had been running on adrenaline for hours, pushing through exhaustion and fear to keep others calm, and the moment the crisis finally eased, something inside her simply gave way. She found herself sitting on an overturned crate near the edge of the wreckage, her hands shaking uncontrollably, tears streaming down her face before she even registered she was crying. Unlike every other time before, she made no attempt to hide it, no quick wipe of her sleeve, no forced smile pulled hastily into place. She simply sat there, overwhelmed, allowing herself, for the first time in longer than she could remember, to fall apart in front of others, without immediately trying to fix her own composure. Callum, who had arrived partway through the rescue efforts to help coordinate additional resources, spotted her from across the settlement and hurried over immediately, his own relief at the successful rescue giving way to concern the moment he saw his daughter's tears. "Illyra," he said, kneeling beside the crate, his voice gentle. "What's wrong?" "I'm fine," she started automatically, the old reflex rising even now, but the words caught in her throat, and instead of forcing the familiar smile into place, she simply shook her head, admitting the truth for once, instead of hiding it. "I'm not fine. It was just so much today, and I didn't know how to hold all of it, and I'm just so tired." Callum wrapped his arms around her without hesitation, pulling her into a firm, steady embrace. "You don't have to hold it all," he said softly. "Not by yourself. Not ever again." She cried against her father's shoulder, the tears finally coming freely, after years of careful suppression, and for the first time in longer than she could recall, she didn't feel ashamed of the vulnerability. She felt, instead, an overwhelming sense of relief, as though a weight she'd carried for years had finally found somewhere safe to rest, even if only for this single moment. Kaelin approached quietly, giving father and daughter space for a long moment, before finally kneeling beside them as well, his presence steady and reassuring, rather than intrusive. "You did incredible work today," he said gently, once Illyra's tears had slowed enough for her to look up. "All of it, including this." "Crying in front of everyone?" she asked, a shaky, self-deprecating laugh escaping despite herself. "Being human," Kaelin corrected gently. "There's no shame in reaching your limit after a day like today. Everyone here reached theirs eventually. You're not weaker for showing it. If anything, you're stronger for finally letting yourself." Several nearby warriors and settlers, having witnessed the successful rescue and now catching sight of Illyra's emotional moment, offered quiet nods of understanding rather than judgment. No one whispered, no one looked at her with pity or discomfort. If anything, the shared exhaustion and relief of the day's crisis had created a strange, unifying sense of solidarity among everyone present, a recognition that today had been difficult for all of them, and that no one needed to hide their struggle to manage it. For the first time in her adult life, Illyra allowed herself to be seen falling apart, and instead of the disaster she had always feared such exposure would bring, she found only comfort, support, and the steady presence of the two people who cared for her most, kneeling beside her without judgment, simply present, simply there. As the sun began to set over the ruined but recovering settlement, Illyra sat between her father and her alpha, feeling lighter than she had in years, the crack in her carefully built armor, finally letting in something she hadn't realized she'd been desperately needing all along. The simple, profound relief of not having to carry everything alone. In the days following the landslide rescue, something had shifted openly within Illyra, a quiet willingness to let people see beyond the polished surface she'd maintained for so long. It wasn't a sudden transformation, not a complete unraveling of old habits overnight, but a gradual softening, like ice thinning slowly under steady warmth, rather than shattering all at once. Callum noticed it first in small ways. She began mentioning when she was tired, instead of insisting she was fine. She accepted help occasionally when it was offered, allowing someone else to carry supplies she would have previously insisted on managing alone. She still struggled with the old instincts, the reflexive urge to minimize her own needs in favor of everyone else's. But she was trying, visibly and consistently, and that effort meant more to her father than any amount of effortless perfection ever could have. It was Kaylin who gently suggested, nearly 2 weeks after the rescue, that she might consider speaking with Mira, the pack's healer, someone known throughout the community for her quiet wisdom and her gift for helping people work through difficult emotions rather than simply masking them. "I don't know what I'd even say to her," Elira admitted one evening as they walked together near the training grounds, the sun setting in soft gold tones across the horizon. "I've never talked about any of this with anyone who wasn't already involved." "You don't need to have all the words ready," Kaylin said. "Mira's good at helping people find them, and you don't have to tell her everything at once. Just start somewhere." Elira considered the suggestion for several days, before finally working up the courage to visit Mira's small cottage, at the edge of the pack grounds. The healer welcomed her warmly, without any hint of surprise or judgment, offering tea and a comfortable seat by the window, before settling into an easy, unhurried conversation that gradually eased into deeper territory. "Kaylin mentioned you might come by," Mira said gently, once Elira had settled into the quiet rhythm of the visit. "He didn't tell me anything specific, just that you might need someone to talk to." Relief washed through Elira at the reassurance that her privacy remained intact, even in this referral. "I don't really know where to start," she admitted. "Most people don't," Mira said with a small, understanding smile. "We can start wherever feels least frightening, even something small." Over the following weeks, Elira found herself returning to Mira's cottage regularly, sometimes weekly, sometimes more often during particularly difficult stretches. She began, slowly and carefully, unpacking years of accumulated grief and pressure, the loss of her mother at such a young age, the unspoken expectation she'd placed on herself to hold everyone else together, the years of learning that her own pain needed to remain invisible in order for her to remain useful. Mira taught her, patiently and without judgment, healthier ways to manage the overwhelming moments when old urges resurfaced. Breathing techniques to ground herself when anxiety spiked, the importance of naming her feelings honestly, rather than immediately reaching for distraction or productivity. Simple, practical strategies for reaching out to someone, whether her father or Kaylin or even Mira herself, during difficult moments, instead of retreating into old, harmful patterns of coping alone. "It's not going to disappear overnight," Mira told her during one particularly difficult session, when Elira had confessed to a strong urge returning during a stressful week that she had, with great effort, managed to redirect instead of acting on. "Healing isn't a straight line. There will be difficult days even as you get stronger. What matters is that you keep reaching for healthier tools, instead of falling back into old ones, and that you keep letting people support you through the harder moments, instead of hiding them." Elira absorbed the guidance slowly, testing it in small ways throughout her daily life. When frustration built during a difficult training session, instead of pushing through silently and letting it fester, she found herself confiding in one of the younger warriors about her struggle, discovering unexpected comfort in shared vulnerability, rather than isolated composure. When a wave of old sadness surfaced unexpectedly during a quiet evening alone, she resisted the urge to simply distract herself with busy work, and instead sat with the feeling, breathing through it the way Mira had taught her, eventually finding her way back to calm, without needing anything more destructive to manage the storm. Her father noticed the changes with quiet, growing pride, making a point to check in with her regularly, not with the anxious hovering of someone waiting for disaster, but with the steady presence of someone simply glad to be included in his daughter's life again. Their relationship deepened, in ways neither of them had realized they'd been missing, conversations flowing more honestly, shared silences feeling comfortable rather than strained. Kaylin remained a steady presence throughout her healing, never pushing too hard, never treating her progress as something to monitor or manage, but simply continuing to show up, consistently and genuinely, in ways both large and small. Their walks together became a regular part of her week, conversations ranging from pack matters to lighter topics entirely, laughter returning more easily between them, the more comfortable she became in her own vulnerability. One evening, several months after that first difficult conversation in the forest, Elira found herself walking that same familiar path with Kaylin, the autumn air crisp and cool around them, the pack house glowing warmly in the distance behind them. "I've been thinking," she said, breaking a comfortable silence between them, "about how different I feel now, compared to a few months ago. I still have hard days, but they don't scare me the way they used to. I know now that I don't have to handle them alone." "That's real progress," Kaylin said, genuine warmth evident in his voice. "You should be proud of how far you've come." "I am," she admitted, a small, honest smile touching her lips, entirely different from the practiced smiles she used to offer so freely. "I don't think I would have gotten here without you pushing gently in the right direction, and without my father finally seeing me clearly again." "You did the hardest part yourself," Kaylin said. "We just made sure you didn't have to do it entirely alone." She glanced at him, something warm and steady blooming in her chest, a feeling she had slowly begun allowing herself to acknowledge over the past several weeks, one she suspected, from the way he looked back at her, might not be entirely one-sided. The Harvest Festival arrived with its usual bright energy, the entire pack gathering across the main courtyard, tables laden with food, lanterns strung between the trees casting warm light over the celebration. Brielle, who had taken charge of the event's organization months earlier, moved through the crowd with confident ease, occasionally glancing toward Elira for advice, but largely managing the festivities on her own, a small but meaningful sign of how much had shifted since that quiet dinner conversation months before. Elira stood near the edge of the courtyard, watching the celebration unfold with a genuine, unguarded smile, a plate of food actually in her hands rather than set aside while she attended to everyone else's needs first. It had taken months of small, deliberate practice, but she had finally begun learning how to simply enjoy a gathering as a participant, rather than constantly positioning herself as its invisible caretaker. "You look like you're actually relaxing," Kaylin said, appearing beside her with his own plate of festival food, a teasing warmth in his voice. "I'm trying," she said with a small laugh. "Old habits are persistent, but I'm getting better at catching myself." They stood together comfortably, watching the festivities, occasionally commenting on various pack members as they passed, sharing easy laughter over small observations. It had become a familiar rhythm between them, this comfortable companionship, one that had deepened steadily over the months since that first difficult conversation, evolving into something neither of them had explicitly named, but which both clearly felt. Later, as the festival wound down, and most of the pack had drifted toward their homes, Elira found herself walking with Kaylin once more, along the familiar forest path, the night air cool and quiet around them, stars scattered brightly overhead. "I want to tell you something," Kaylin said, stopping beneath the shelter of an old oak tree, moonlight filtering softly through its branches. "And I want you to know, I'm not saying this because I feel sorry for you, or because I want to fix you, because you were never broken in the way you feared." Elira's heart quickened slightly at the seriousness in his tone, though nothing about his expression suggested anything but warmth. "Okay," she said softly. "When I first found you crying in that kitchen, I thought I was simply looking out for a member of my pack who needed support," Kaylin said. "But somewhere over these past months, watching you fight so hard to heal, watching you rebuild yourself piece by piece, with more courage than I've seen in warriors twice your experience, I realized my feelings for you had become something much deeper than simple concern." Elira's breath caught, her eyes searching his face for any hint of hesitation, finding only steady sincerity instead. "Kaylin, I'm not asking for anything you're not ready to give," he continued gently. "I know your healing has to come first, and it always will. But I wanted you to know that somewhere along the way, watching your strength and your growth, I fell in love with you. Not the version of you that performs endless usefulness for everyone else's comfort, the real you. The one who cries when things are hard, and reaches for help instead of hiding. The one who's brave enough to keep choosing healing, even on the difficult days." Tears filled Elira's eyes, though these were different from every tear she'd shed before, warm and overwhelming in an entirely new way. "I've felt the same way for a while now," she admitted quietly. I think I was just afraid to trust it, afraid that if I let myself want something for me, it would somehow be selfish, or that I'd lose it the moment I stopped being useful enough to deserve it. You never had to earn love through usefulness, Kaylin said, reaching out to gently take her hand, the first deliberate touch between them beyond simple companionship. Not from your father, not from this pack, and not from me. You deserve to be loved simply because of who you are. She stepped closer, closing the remaining distance between them, and for the first time in longer than she could remember, Alira allowed herself to fully believe those words, to accept them, without deflecting, without minimizing, without immediately searching for some hidden obligation attached to them. I love you too, she said softly, the words feeling both terrifying and freeing all at once. It's strange. I spent so long thinking I had to hide every part of myself that felt fragile in order to be worthy of anyone's affection. But you saw the most fragile part of me first, and you stayed anyway. I'll keep staying, Kaylin said, his voice steady with quiet promise. Through the good days, and the difficult ones both. Beneath the old oak tree, with the stars scattered brightly overhead and the pack house glowing warmly in the distance, Kaylin leaned down and kissed her gently, a slow, tender affirmation of everything unspoken between them over the past months. Alira kissed him back, feeling, for the first time in her adult life, that she didn't have to be anything other than exactly who she was in order to be loved completely. They stood together beneath the tree for a long while afterward, wrapped in comfortable silence, the weight of years finally beginning to feel lighter, the future ahead of them, uncertain but filled, for the first time, with genuine hope rather than quiet dread. A year passed, marked by seasons turning steadily over the packlands, and the changes within Alira had settled into something solid and lasting, rather than fragile progress that might crumble under pressure. She still visited Mira occasionally, not out of crisis but simply as part of maintaining the healthier patterns she'd worked so hard to build. She still had difficult days, moments when old sadness surfaced unexpectedly, but she met them now with tools that helped rather than habits that harmed, and she never faced them entirely alone. Her relationship with her father had grown into something deeply comfortable, their breakfasts together a cherished routine rather than a novelty, their conversations open and honest in ways that had once felt impossible. Callum often remarked, with quiet wonder in his voice, that he felt as though he'd been given a second chance to truly know his daughter, one he intended never to take for granted again. Her relationship with Kaylin had deepened steadily as well, growing from careful, tentative affection into something the entire pack had come to recognize and celebrate. He never once made her feel as though her past struggles defined her, nor did he treat her healing as complete or finished, understanding instead that growth was an ongoing process, rather than a destination reached once and never revisited. On a bright, clear morning, nearly 13 months after that first night in the kitchen, the entire pack gathered once more in the courtyard, this time not for a harvest festival, but for a celebration of an entirely different kind. Alira stood before the assembled pack members, dressed in soft ivory, her hand held steadily in Kaylin's, as they exchanged vows before their community, promises built not on performance or perfection, but on genuine partnership and mutual support. I promise to see you, Kaylin said during the ceremony, his voice carrying clearly across the quiet courtyard. Not just the strength you show the world, but the person underneath it, on your hardest days and your easiest ones alike. I promise to let myself be seen, Alira replied, her voice steady and sure, in a way that would have been unimaginable to her a year earlier. Even when it's difficult, even when old fears whisper that I should hide instead. I promise to keep choosing honesty over performance, and to trust that I don't have to earn love through endless usefulness. Callum stood among the gathered crowd, tears of genuine joy streaming freely down his face, as he watched his daughter, healed and whole in ways he'd once feared might never be possible, step forward into a future built on honesty rather than careful concealment. Brielle stood nearby, having grown into her own confident leadership within the pack, smiling warmly at the woman who had once quietly mentored her, without ever taking credit for her own generosity. As the ceremony concluded and the celebration began in earnest, Alira found a quiet moment alone with her new husband near the edge of the courtyard, watching the joyful chaos of the pack celebration unfold before them. "Do you remember," she asked softly, "that night you found me in the kitchen?" I was so certain my whole world would fall apart if anyone ever saw how much I was struggling. I remember, Kaylin said, wrapping an arm gently around her shoulders. And instead, look at everything that grew from that single moment of being seen. I used to think being strong meant never letting anyone see me struggle, Elira said, leaning into his warmth. Now I understand that real strength was always about being brave enough to let people in, even when it felt terrifying. You were always strong, Kaylin said, pressing a gentle kiss to her temple. You just needed people around you brave enough to notice, and patient enough to wait until you were ready to let them help. Around them, the pack continued its joyful celebration. Warriors and healers and families alike gathered together beneath the bright autumn sky, unaware of just how far the quiet, radiant woman at its center had traveled to stand here today, whole and healed and finally, completely, at peace with exactly who she was. Elira looked out over the community that had once nearly missed her silent suffering entirely, now bound together more closely than ever, through the simple, powerful truth that no one, no matter how capable or strong they appeared, should ever have to carry their deepest pain entirely alone. And standing beside the man who had first noticed her tears in that quiet kitchen so many months ago, she felt, for the first time in her life, completely and unashamedly herself. The story of the Alpha King and his Beta's daughter became, in time, a quiet legend among the pack. Not a tale of tragedy, but one of gentle, persistent love, proof that even the deepest hidden wounds could heal when met with patience, understanding, and the steady courage to finally let someone else help carry the weight.